Okay, so thank you for this, for your attention. We're just about to start the next session, which will run till about 4:30. And as you can see on the slide, it's about crossing the social science policy boundary. So we're going to be talking about two different things today. One is the kind of agile response part of the Access network, and secondly, the very specific work that's been going on, led by Karen Bickerstaff here on the Net Zero Task Force that's culminating around about now. So, in terms of the people that you're going to be listening to over the next 40 minutes, we'll just do very brief introductions. So, you know me already. Karen, do you want to just...
So I'm Karen Bickerstaff, Professor in Geography at Exeter, and I've been leading the Agile work, the Agile arm of Access, and one of the things that we've been doing in that Agile work is a task force on Net Zero, which is what I'm going to talk about in a little bit.
Great, okay. We have two other people who are speaking. Simone, would you like to introduce yourself, please?
Thank you. Yeah, Simone Abram. I'm in the Anthropology Department at Durham University. I'm the Executive Director of the Durham Energy Institute.
Great. And finally, Susan, would you like to introduce yourself, please?
I am Susan Owens. I am Professor Emerita, allegedly, of Environment and Policy at the University of Cambridge. And I probably should say up front that I'll be speaking in my capacity as Chair of the Programme Advisory Board of Access, but also in an academic capacity, and I won't say very much about public policy.
Okay, thank you. So I just want to say just a few seconds first about why we're having a conversation about a task force at this event in the first place. And it's because in Access, I guess we learned a little bit from health research. If Linda's still here and is able to pitch in, there was an awful lot of agile research done very quickly in the last 5 years, obviously in response to the pandemic. And that's picked up on, I suppose, wider thoughts about the speed with which decision makers need evidence, but the pace with which academics are able to provide that evidence base. And those two actually rarely sync up for lots of reasons that are structurally. So what we decided to put in the proposal, and I think we were encouraged by ESRC, was to think about how we could mobilize social science knowledge and evidence and insights in a slightly more rapid way than, a 3 to 4 to 5 year time frame. So we planned to do several of these, and the idea behind the task force idea, so there's two strands, I suppose. One is a bit of a reactive piece of work, a bit like the Ask BR UK that we heard before, but the other one was to mobilize different disciplines in a task force on some challenging policy issue and to bring the different disciplines together, and we chose net zero as the first one of those. So over to you, Karen, to describe the task force in a bit more detail.
Okay, so we chose to focus our initial task force on net zero. And think about what the social sciences bring to policy around net zero. So to identify gaps and draw, to some extent it was a synthetic exercise, so bringing to bear key social science evidence that's already out there. One of the key priorities for the task force, so we assembled a task force of 12 people, 12 academics, and one of the key things that we were seeking to do there was to bring a range of social science disciplines and expertise to bear. So as you can see from the list, probably many familiar names, but you can see that expertise draws from across anthropology, geography, political sciences, medical sciences, and also crucially, quite central to the task force makeup was Pete Bailey and Katie Dow at the Environment Agency. So they were always locked into the task force process. The task force ran for a year, so it ran from April last year to April this year, and it's still in the process of generating material. So it's a 12-month process, and we focused on this idea of making a net zero society. So the critical role of the social sciences in making net zero happen. So delivering the goals of net zero, you have to embed social sciences within that. And there were three aspects. So we met regularly as a group, mostly online, and there were three aspects to the work programme that we conducted as the task force. So first of all, there was a targeted drill down into particular areas of social science research. So we identified 6 themes, and we developed these quite bespoke literature reviews on those topics, so issues to do with race, to do with equity and justice, which Linda raised, and several other areas of social science work. The other thing that we did, and this was very much influenced by Pete Bailey from the EA, was that we did a quite focused analysis of some recent examples of government policy on net zero. So we didn't look across the piece in terms of all UK net zero policy, but picked 3 examples that were targeted at different audiences that had slightly different objectives, and did an analysis of those 3 documents. The third element of the task force work was to look at case studies. So look at case studies of historic societal transitions, and use that as a way of identifying conditions for social transformation. So what kind of ingredients that accounted for successful or more problematic transition processes, and whether we could come up with a framework based on that. So on the right there are the 8 examples, the 8 case studies that we chose. Some of them were quite environment facing, others were not. They operated at different scales. Some of them were successful, some of them were more problematic. So we had a range of case studies. And in terms of the approach that we took in terms of generating the knowledge, it was primarily based around the 12 members of the task force, but at key moments we brought in policy expertise from academia, but also from government. So we liaised quite heavily with Go Science, DESNES, the British Academy, and so on. So that was the work that we did. We're now in the process of building a manifesto. We have built a manifesto, like many other at the moment. Manifestos are very in vogue. And in a similar vein, we're trying to, I suppose, catapult the social sciences to the centre of debate on net zero. So to be quite assertive in stating what the social sciences bring to net zero policy, and why, you know, if we're thinking back to that idea of the pipeline, why social sciences should be much more in those upstream decision-making and policy processes. So we've put this manifesto together that draws on those 3 strands of the work that I outlined. And what we've produced on the basis of that is a set of recommendations. Okay, so I'm not going to go through them in detail because we haven't got a huge amount of time. And in many ways, these are familiar. This isn't, you know, we're not suggesting these are new findings, but what we've been trying to do is draw together key threads from across the social sciences and quite assertively make a stand for why the social sciences are crucial and important to translating net zero and making it happen. So just to draw on a couple of examples, so one of the key things that arose from the analysis of the policy documents was the focus, you know, as we all know, the focus on supply side technology-focused changes. And here we've been very clear in emphasising the importance of demand reduction, the need to put demand reduction centre stage, and to think about what we already know from the social sciences about how to deliver sustained and systemic demand reduction. Another key issue that we have highlighted, so point 3, is the importance of ideas that galvanise people. So when we looked at the case studies, one of the key issues that came up there was the importance of issues that connect people, draw people together, and are a way of managing some of the contestations and controversies that we see around transition. So the importance of identifying collective visions, positive social benefits, and so on. And then a third point, just to flag the importance of mid-level actors. So we talk a lot, we see a lot of talk in the social sciences, in policy, about the need for top-down change from government, and also a focus on bottom-up changes, the role of individuals, the role of consumers. And so what we've tried to articulate very clearly here is the importance of mid-level actors, so local authorities, schools, community groups, NGOs, and so on, which often have a very specific place, dimension to them. as well. So the manifesto will be out very soon. Lots of people are saying that too. And we will undoubtedly be circulating that. It would be great to get feedback on it. What I wanted to do just to end in terms of thinking about this session on the social science policy boundary is really bring together some reflections we've been having about doing agile and policy engaged work to think about this collectively. And the process of doing policy engaged work is tricky, and I think we have found it challenging at various points. And so what I've just flagged here is some of the questions that we've been starting to ask ourselves about this work and this boundary between the social sciences and policy. The first one here is thinking about practices, so how we go about doing policy engaged, boundary crossing work. The different methods, the different approaches that we're taking, and how these have evolved over time. And this isn't new, this has been going on. I mean, Susan is a brilliant example of this, that this policy engaged work has been happening for many, many decades. And that reflection on experience and how those practices have evolved. One of the issues that Patrick talked to is the rhythms of doing policy engaged work. It's one of the challenges we found with trying to develop different kinds of rapid engaged research that have very different temporalities and timeframes that create their own challenges and often create tensions in terms of the timeframes and rhythms of policy and decision making, and Linda spoke to that as well. Questions about co-production, diversity and difference, what that means in the context of boundary crossing work, what that looks like. What does co-production look like when you've got a very rapid timetable for doing the work? Some really key questions that I'm sure will be raised by the panellists about evidence and impact. So questions about what kind of social science is most effective, what has the most traction in environmental policy arenas, and we probably all have ideas about that. And from a social science perspective, how do we need to lean into these expectations, or are there ways in which we can expand them and disrupt those norms and expectations? One of the issues that Pete raised early on from a policy point of view is actually that to some extent the challenge for us in doing the task force was less about generating the knowledge and much more about communicating it and thinking about the messages. And I think that's a really important issue, is how do we communicate, how do we share the insights from social science in a way that lands and has traction. It's quite an odd phrase, but the idea of boundary spanners, so Pete and Katie at the EA, Gary Cass, another one, have been key in helping us mediate that relationship between the social sciences and policy. So these actors that wear different hats can make a critical difference in ensuring that our research lands in the right circles. Questions about what success looks like. Again, really challenging and probably reflect different perspectives from policy worlds, social science worlds, research funders, and the challenges around that and how we measure success and whether we can deliver on the sort of expectations we have or the expectations associated with impact agendas. And then here, I suppose, questions about structural and organisational challenges. So those expectations about what impact looks like and how feasible it is to deliver impact in relatively short project timeframes. And that's one of the key things, I suppose, that we've learned from doing the task force. Actually, a 12-month period felt like quite a long time, but actually to build relationships and to follow that through takes far, far longer. And different ways of working, different professional norms, different ways of thinking about research and the impacts of research. And then finally, questions of learning, and I guess this is part of the point of running this session, is to think about our learning as part of access, as part of broader learning in terms of doing this kind of boundary crossing and policy engaged research. So those are some of the questions and issues that we've been exploring in the context of our agile and task force work.
Great. Back to me then.
Do you want to be Pete Baker?
Yeah, so I'm really sorry, everybody,
But we've got this very, very unfortunate situation where Pete Bailey, who was, as I said, with Katie Dow, absolutely central to the delivery of our task force. But Pete has unfortunately come across very unfortunate family circumstances, a bereavement of somebody close to him. So Pete is not going to be here. So I'm going to be Pete for a moment. And he sent me a couple of bullet points. So just to imagine Pete's voice emerging into the room here.
So this won't take very long at all, and then maybe we can move on to the other discussants. But basically, Pete was saying that most impact framings in academia, maybe social science in particular, are more or less nonsense exclamation and then just very simplistically framed. It doesn't represent the reality of what happens at that governance interface. And he's really saying that it should be much better informed by social science itself, particularly areas like science and technology studies and political science. And he expresses frustration that Susie and Tracy, UKRI/ESRC, don't necessarily use the insight they've actually funded themselves. So that's, a kind of a neglect of evidence which he finds frustrating. But to be slightly more hopeful, ESRC funding for initiatives like Access do suggest recognition that this is a very complex, difficult thing to do. It requires effort and bespoke work in relationship building across these boundaries. So, and hopefully that's something which Access is trying to contribute as well. So they were just some points that Pete was going to make if he was here. I think I'd like to ask Simone to come up now and talk about it from your point of view, because you were involved in the task force yourself.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I was reflecting a bit on this task that the task force was set, and the fact that it brought together a group who, I mean, these were obviously delighted to be invited because they're people whose work I know, was looking forward to meet, and realised we all probably know a little bit of each other's work, but we're all bringing kind of different literatures, different approaches. And there's something about the way that we see social science as a category, as if we can just bring it together and then come up with some results. Shall we categorise, or shall we characterise social science? How incredibly ambitious that was as an aim. And as you say, a year, I felt like it was, we've got a year to do this, but actually when you say, 3-4 meetings or something, it's extraordinarily challenging. And I think that's a problem for policy making as well, that you think that, we'll ask a social scientist. That doesn't really tell you anything about what you're getting, because it's so incredibly varied, and there's no reason why we should all agree with each other. So sort of boiling it down to a small number of messages and points in a manifesto, I mean, I guess maybe it is a little bit like a political party trying to put a manifesto together on all the sort of broad church approach that we have really different interests. But I was just thinking about the way that comes over, and the way that the idea of social science in government is itself a bit of a challenge. So that we heard this morning the idea that disagreement is something that's difficult for policymakers to deal with. They want clear evidence. And I think part of our responsibility is sometimes, I think we've tried to do this in the manifesto, is sometimes to say the evidence may not be clear, and you may actually be dealing with very different interpretations, even within the so-called science, and it doesn't necessarily make the politics any easier. But one thing we can do is to give you, narrative and different frameworks in which to think through these very complex and wicked problems, for example. That might open up opportunities for policy to be more effective. So, my reflection is primarily the challenge and how interesting it has been to discuss some of these things. So I think the manifesto is almost like a first step. I feel like we could do this again.
In 5 years.
Yeah, we could definitely do it again. And I think the approach to focus on using what we know to analyse some documents is a really effective way to go. Because otherwise, how could we have found a focus otherwise? I think that was a small stroke of genius to say, let's do it by throwing our expertise at these documents and saying, I have to slightly admit though a little bit of vested interest because I was involved in writing one of the documents. I'm not sure you knew that But
I
yeah.
think we do, actually.
Yeah, we did.
Yeah. So that was a very constructive method, I think. And I do think it's a very unusual experience, because I think when we normally write things like policy briefings, it's out of a particular project.
Yeah.
So to try and take this very much broader approach was both challenging and very interesting, and hopefully very productive. So I'm grateful for the opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you. I should just make clear, I suppose, that we're going to do another one of these, if not maybe two more of these, and we've got Michael sitting here who is beginning to lead the second one. So obviously all of these reflections will feed into the second Access Task Force. But anyway, we have limited time for this session, so I'd really like to call upon Susan now to offer any reflections and points you want to make. And then I hope we have maybe 5 or 10 minutes for Q&A after that, and we'll ask everybody up to the front to sit down. So over to you, Susan,
Okay.
speaking in the very defined position that you were. Exactly, that was made very clear. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Patrick. I'm not going to speak directly about the manifesto, though I've read all the documentation with enormous interest, and a lot of what I say and what's in that documentation I hope will resonate with each other. I did broadly try to address at least 3 of the 4 questions, and I won't spell out how, but I hope that will come through as well. Sorry, I'm struck dumb unless I have a set of illegible notes. Quite helpful. So I want to make 4 sets of comments. The first is really taking up the issue of mobilising social scientific research. And I'll say just once, I won't keep repeating it, but I think this goes for humanities research as well, because in so many of the areas that we're interested in, the social sciences and humanities have got enormous amounts to offer. Let me say a little bit about my own experience. So I have been interested in environmental governance for an embarrassing number of decades, and especially latterly interested in knowledge policy interactions, the role of evidence, argument, ideas in in those interactions, and particularly the role of expertise and advisory practices. At the same time, I've been involved in a number of different contexts and capacities in actually giving advice, both in the UK and outside the UK. So there's, in a sense, I've always done research, for a very long time, done research on processes that I've also been involved in. So I think the best way to put that is that there's an ethnographic dimension to what I do. Just a few very general comments on mobilising social scientific knowledge. My observation is that over the last 30 or 40 years there's been a huge increase in recognition of how important insights from the social sciences and the humanities are, both for policy and policies of different institutions and for practice. And in a sense it's become, as everyone in this room knows only too well through the impact agenda and similar forces, it has become something to be achieved. You know, the influence of knowledge on policy is something to be achieved. So I simply want to make the observation that knowledge-policy interactions are also a subject of intellectual inquiry in their own right, as well as being something to be achieved. If you like, that can be summed up as there is an awful lot of evidence out there about evidence-based policy. And that is always recognised, you know, across all areas of work. So that's one broad comment. The second is about the way that we think and conceptualise knowledge policy interactions. And I only really want to pick up one point just to see what people think about it in discussion maybe. It's the extraordinary tenacity of the so-called technical rational or linear rational model of that set of relationships, in which, in a kind of sausage machine model, knowledge goes in at one end and unproblematically informs policy and practice, and better policies and practices emerge at the other end. And it's a very long-standing model. It is absolutely tenacious. It's never quite been. It's been subject to powerful critique, countervailing empirical evidence, lived experience. Almost everyone involved in that relationship knows it doesn't work like that, but the model lives in a kind of indestructible way. Stephen Turner put it rather nicely in 2014 in a book about politics of expertise. Very succinctly, he said, "Little about this model is not misleading." So there's an interesting question, and other models are available, of course, and many people in this room will have engaged in other ways of thinking and speaking about the role of knowledge in informing the policies of various institutions. So there's an interesting question about why is it so tenacious? How does it go on living? And I've latterly wondered whether actually it has some utility for everyone involved in these relationships. Otherwise, maybe it would be difficult to keep it alive. So perhaps it does retain some utility. No time to go into the other models. Thirdly, I just wanted to say something about what I call in my last book, Knowledge, Policy and Expertise, something about the circumstances of influence. Because access, in a way, is all about influence, mobilising social science knowledge, and Pete Bailey, if he'd been here, would have said some quite robust things, obviously, about impact and influence. So I want to draw very, very briefly on the very long-running study I did of the former Royal Commission on Environmental Pollution, which existed from 1971 till 2011, provided over that time a vast amount of advice, synthesising knowledge from a wide variety of sources. And in the end, having looked in depth at that, I decided that influence is best conceptualised as a spectrum or continuum of different sorts of effects. And then actually we would all quite like to see what's at one far end of that spectrum, which I call direct hits. You know, you produce some research and wow, suddenly it has documentable influence. The sort you can write up in an impact case study, that's really, and we all know how hard that is to do, actually, for various reasons. So I think it's best conceptualised as a spectrum with direct hits, visible short-term effects at one end, and brick walls at the other end, where it doesn't have any impact whatsoever on anyone. In between, I think we have variations, gradations, dormant seeds. So, you might produce some research which doesn't seem to have much effect, but later it does. One of my very, very early work, I didn't really think about, didn't have impact agendas in those days, but I didn't think about it very much. And, I'd moved on and I was doing other things, and all of a sudden it suddenly was of interest to someone, and it acquired influence 10 or 15 years later. So dormant seeds, usually because circumstances change in some way. Then there's a much slower burn type of influence, which a person called James, that's the surname, by the way, not just James, called atmospheric influence. And it tends to go along with things like slowly changing the frame, where your research might contribute to a very broad shift, perhaps, in the way that questions are thought about and defined, and social norms might change in the meantime. So that kind of influence is annoyingly hard to trace, but certainly in the case of the body that I studied, the Royal Commission, that was the influence that really, really mattered, more than, in some ways, more than the short-term diet. So I think Carol Weiss, the American political scientist, speaks, for example, of knowledge creeping into policy very slowly. And hard to, it doesn't, your research doesn't come with radioactive markers, so you can pick it up downstream 10 years later, unfortunately. You can try and put a few in sometimes. And the factors involved then in whether a particular piece of work has influence, or the time frame over which it might have influence, are manifold. They include the political environment, social norms, institutional rigidities, and what Harold Macmillan famously referred to as events, dear boy, events. And I think I picked that up in some of the documentation because you could talk about galvanising factors. And others, for example, Bill Salisbury back in the 1980s, I think, talked about particularising events. John Kingdon, I'm sure a lot of you will know his work in the American system, talks about focusing events. So there can be all sorts of problems and things developing and research going on, and then suddenly something will happen that will focus events. And then Kingdon says you get windows of opportunity and things can happen. Okay, one point from all of that. Policy relevance might not be, but it might come into being. So don't give up hope. Just finish with a few challenges for the social sciences, and I'll bracket humanities as well. So I think from various experience that over the last several decades, there has been a very considerable increase in recognition of the significance of insights from the social sciences. There really is. There's quite an appetite now for social science perspectives. What is still a bit more difficult, and we've heard about this earlier this afternoon as well, is appreciating the full breadth of what the social sciences have to offer. So in circumstances where people think, oh, we should have a social science perspective on that, often what's thought of, and these are very important areas, I'm not in any way suggesting otherwise, but often what comes to mind is economics and behavioural sciences, often, and again as we've heard earlier, somewhat vaguely defined, behavioural perspectives. And sometimes those two areas have become synonymous with social science as a whole, but everyone, I think, recognises that there are other disciplines that are also very important. So that's one challenge, I think, is trying to communicate about the full breadth of the social sciences. Secondly, there's a challenge sometimes in social scientific insights being seen as evidence, as legitimate evidence. And that might, this is a bit speculative, but that might, I think it probably is more the case when the work is qualitative and can't necessarily be encapsulated in terms of numbers and communicable, isn't necessarily communicable in that sense. Linda Boldola talked about a hierarchy of evidence. So there's something of a challenge there in making sure that qualitative work gets analysed in, I'm echoing Steve Hinchley because I've heard him say this lots and lots of times, really important that qualitative work gets analysed using proper qualitative techniques and then communicated as qualitative findings and not somehow turned into quasi-quantitative findings, which when it's qualitative work can be really misleading. And then thirdly, and I'll finish on this point, there is still a challenge in what we might call upstreaming of the social sciences, bringing the social science insights into play when they can make really significant differences, including, helping with the framing of problems, solutions, questions to be addressed, and so on. Because, again, in my experience over several decades, there has been quite a strong tendency to treat the social sciences in delivery mode for preformed objectives and to bring those insights in when it's a bit too late for them sometimes to make a difference. So those are my thoughts, very, very broadly set.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. It was great. Yeah. Wouldn't it be great if we had a couple of hours to talk about so many things? We've actually got about 5 minutes, which is very scary. But we have a panel here. We have, I guess, possible questions in the room. We certainly have 1 or 2 online. And given that we haven't had any, I think, input from our hybrid online people so far, Jim, would you like to channel that opinion? Pick 1 or 2 or whatever.
Well, these are both from Beth Rocket from Cross Research.
2 questions from Beth.
Well, one reflection.
Okay.
So one is to all the panel. So what recommendations would each panel member have for the upcoming task force on biodiversity? And as a social scientist working in a policy and practice space, it soon became clear knowledge transfer was neither linear nor rational, and the production of policy briefs from research was never going to be enough. What can we do to challenge the linear rational knowledge model, and who should we start with? I'm often surprised at how many academic colleagues still believe that if something is accepted in academia, somehow it will leach into policy, stroke practice, and be magically translated into policy and policy delivery. There we are.
Okay, right. Well, I think that's a big question. So, Karen, do you want to start off, and then we'll leave Susan.
So with both questions, or with the one you want to answer?
Yeah.
So in terms of the next task force, I think that collaboration between, and it will be Beth and Michael, and understanding what the problem is, because we started with net zero, which is massive. And I mean, Simone touched on this, that in a way we needed to perhaps work through it. I mean, I think, as you said, the policy documents really helped to bring it, to crystallise what we wanted to do. But I think that relationship is so central, thinking about the problem that the social sciences is, or that the task force is addressing is crucial.
Simone?
Yeah, thank you. I'm going to address the last point because I think it's absolutely right. It's like writing a policy briefing and sending it to somebody is never going to have a massive effect. It's about relationships. It's about building relationships, getting to know people. I was thinking about the fact that in Durham, I'm involved in a lot of engineering and science projects as like one of the social scientists. So most of my colleagues in Durham think social science is anthropology. Well, I think anthropology is social science, which is fine, obviously. but it, it's, I notice when new people come in, it reminds me how far we've come in some of our other relationships, that their expectations of what it means to have a social scientist or a group of social scientists in a project is very different. But over time that changes, and I think exactly the same in policy relationships. The challenge with that is that if you're working with anyone in Whitehall, they're very unlikely to be there for long enough to build a decent relationship. That is a serious issue, but if you can try and broaden it out, make it a little bit more institutional, you've got a chance of some kind of continuity. But I think that's the biggest challenge.
And the project time frames are short, so actually that continuity is incredibly difficult.
Yeah, I mean, that means you can never assume that, you can never make any assumptions about what's been learned. Because you can, well, probably the only one you can make is that nothing's been learned. You're always having to start again, which is challenging.
Okay, thank you. And Susan?
Yeah, I think I can't answer those questions directly at the moment, I don't think. But I would say
Right,
just a few things that I can't answer them anyway, but I mean...
Oh, you were just leaving us hanging there. We'd have to come back next year if you, Susan.
But I just... I think there's been a journey that lots of people, not just academics, but lots of people come on. So the idea that publishing academic work, as you know, all of us academics have been inculcated in how important it is. Just doing that, putting it in a journal, a book, or whatever, is really important, but it's a bit like putting a message in a bottle, hoping, putting it out to sea and hoping it reaches a fertile shore somewhere. So of course, that model has shifted a lot in the last few decades. And then on the other hand, hoping that those to whom the knowledge is directed will do the job of working out what its relevance is, or to whom the knowledge is not necessarily directed, it's just published. So the question then is who works out what the relevance of new research and research findings is for policy practice, other institutions, whatever. And I don't think we expect that to be done solely by academics or solely by others anymore, but are moving, I think, towards more productive, iterative, networking type processes, as others have mentioned, of which access is a very, very good example. So I think things are getting better, but there's still an awful lot of work to do, and the sort of work that's going on here is really genuinely important.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. Let's just thank all the panel in the usual way.